Joining us this week for the Wednesday Bookmark is Randal Rauser. Randal is Director of Faith-Based Organization Investigations at Veritas Solutions. Prior to going into investigations full-time, Randal spent 20 years as a seminary professor. We're going to talk this morning about his book, co-authored with Bob Stenhouse, Disabuse, How to Prevent, Detect, Investigate, and Eliminate Abuse in Churches and Faith-Based Organizations. Randal, good to talk with you again. Thanks so much for your time.
Well, thanks for having me, Brock. Great to be here.
Chapter 1 hits on 6 of the most common types of abuse, namely harassment, bullying, sexual harassment, sexual abuse, discrimination, and spiritual abuse. Break down 1 or 2 of those types for us, especially in terms of how to effectively recognize the given abuse when we see it.
Oh, for sure. Well, let's start. We'll just talk about maybe harassment and bullying. So, the interesting thing is people often don't realize that they are experiencing abuse or misconduct in the workplace or their environment. So it is important to have definitions at the outset. And just in its core definition, harassment is any comment or conduct that one would reasonably believe is offensive. So it could be something as small as a passive-aggressive snide comment in a business meeting or in a church setting. And over time, those kinds of small things can add up to something pretty significant, which could lead to a toxic or harmful workplace. Bullying just kind of takes harassment to the next level, and bullying is often distinguished by being targeted to individuals over time. So a harassment comment might just be a one-off. Bullying might be an ongoing pattern in the workplace. And when it happens over a slow amount of time, you might not realize you are subject to it until you realize you're at your breaking point. So it's important to identify these behaviors early on and call them out.
In Chapter 2, you consider 3 abuser profiles: the narcissist, the psychopath, and the groomer. What are the key character traits of each one of those?
Yeah, so the narcissist, this is a person, we've probably all experienced narcissists, that they are concerned with their own reputation, and they will often build alliances with other people just insofar as those other people build up their personality and make them look better to others. And it can be exhausting to be in a workplace with a narcissist. Often churches, narcissists, the reality is they often gravitate to the pulpit. They like the recognition that they get week by week in preaching, and they can be very charming and very engaging. But in the long term, they can also be very difficult and harmful to deal with. A psychopath, this is about 1% of the population, but people with sub-psychopathic tendencies or subclinical tendencies may be up to 15% of the population. So it's really not insignificant. And these are people who don't have, to put it bluntly, a moral compass. They simply work to actualize their own interests, and they use other people for their own ends. And again, that could be deeply harmful. A groomer is somebody who they may not be aware that they're doing this, but they target individuals and build relationships with them who they understand to be vulnerable, and they often ingratiate themselves. They are really much beloved by that vulnerable person. Let's say it's a youth pastor and one of the youth in his youth group. He might build a relationship with that individual. And often then even their parents view him as very wonderful, but he builds a special relationship with them, gives gifts, and ultimately exploits them for his own interests. So these can all be deeply harmful individuals and personalities, and it's helpful to be able to identify them in church settings, in workplaces, and in society.
During the middle section of the book, you establish and then you walk us through a case study from the fictional Sunrise Fellowship Church. So let's spend a few minutes there. Set up the case for us. What happened at Sunrise Fellowship Church?
Yeah, so we thought when we're writing the book that it would be helpful for people to understand what a workplace investigation looks like in a church setting. And so that's sort of the scenario here. So we set it up that there is an administrative assistant working with the pastor, and the pastor we didn't want to give too extreme of a situation, but rather one that you might very well encounter in your own workplace experience. So the pastor engages with the administrative assistant in a manner that he threatens her employment, he gets angry at her, he raises his voice. These are things that happen, right? They happen in churches and elsewhere. And she decides to put forward a bullying and harassment complaint in the church. Now, this is the big thing: is churches, they have a plan when there's, let's say, a fire, right? That if smoke comes under the door of the sanctuary, they know to call the fire department. They know how to evacuate the building. They know where the fire extinguisher is. When an abuse allegation arises within churches, however, they typically don't have a plan.
Mm.
So when that smoke starts coming under the door of the sanctuary, they don't know who to call or what to do. So that's the purpose of this whole scenario, is when this person raises this issue of complaint against the pastor, how should the church respond? And so we kind of lead the reader step by step through seeking whether you could handle this internally or whether you should seek an external investigator, somebody like what we do at Veritas Solutions, and then how an external investigator would go through in terms of evaluating evidence, gathering evidence, identifying the allegations, identifying witnesses, and making credibility assessments of the statements of witnesses in order to give the church a finding as to whether the harassment or bullying occurred or not. In the case of the book, the investigator decides it was harassment and bullying. And in fact, as is often the case, it was part of a much larger problem with the pastor.
Mm.
And then the church has to address the fallout from that. So that's kind of that last section of the book there.
What do we need to know about the investigation process itself that you refer to? Things like interviewing witnesses. How can we feel confident that an investigation is being conducted properly and that it's effective?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the reality is, if you go external, you might be looking at significant cost. Whether you go to a human resource risk management firm like Veritas Solutions, or you go, let's say, to a lawyer to do the investigation, there might be a significant cost there. Handling it internally, you may save money. But what you have to consider is the total cost of handling it internally. There could be things like conflicts of interest with handling something internally. And there could be a lack of skills to handle an internal investigation. For example, it's really important to have trauma-informed investigators so that they know how to evaluate the credibility of a witness and how to interview them if they have been impacted by trauma, because trauma affects your memory, affects how you recall things, and then how you communicate it in an interview. Sometimes churches can really magnify the harm if they try to handle things internally and they lack the expertise to do so. So they need to have a plan at the outset to decide how they're going to triage and assess the initial credibility of complaints, the nature and risk presented by the complaint, and then whether to go internal or external in addressing it.
And you say that an allegation is ultimately assessed with respect to two specific questions. Did it happen? And does it qualify as abuse? Assuming the answer to both questions is yes, what's next?
Great question. So much is going to depend on what the allegation was, right? If it was a low-level instance of harassment or bullying, well, then there may be, and I'll just say this, that we as investigators we don't make recommendations for how a church should respond. But I'll just say that, so a church is going to have to, or an organization is going to have to figure out, is this something we can handle through coaching, through some kind of restorative process, or in the more extreme cases, like significant sexual harassment or sexual abuse allegations, this is something that involves termination. And of course, there could be a whole range of responses that could be appropriate depending on the nature, the significance, and the impact of the abuse.
Last question, Randal. Speak to that person listening who may, God forbid, currently be caught in or aware of a situation that they at least suspect may be abuse. What should they do first?
Let me just say at the outset, so Jesus, he describes the church as being salt and light, a city on a hill. And the sad thing is, often churches have not responded in keeping with that mandate or those images to allegations of abuse. There have been, the response initially is often to protect the reputation of the institution rather than to seek justice and protection for potential abuse survivors. So the church, I think, needs to be grounded in a culture that welcomes allegations if they are grounded in good faith. If people bring forward something, they have to be heard, and the church has to have created a safe space to welcome them and then to bring about healing. That's the first thing I would say. So then you should have a designated, identifiable person that you can go to. And so that would be another thing, be like an HR person, something like that. Somebody who has an independence from the relationships. Because the one thing you can't have is, if the only person, let's say the head pastor is the person who's engaging in abusive conduct, and if that's the only person you can go to, you're in an impossible situation.
Mm-hmm.
So you always have to have institutions set up so that there is an independent third party that a person can go to bring these concerns.
Disabuse: How to Prevent, Detect, Investigate, and Eliminate Abuse in Churches and Faith-Based Organizations. Randal Rauser, co-authored with Bob Stenhouse, our guest this week for the Wednesday Bookmark. Really good stuff. Thank you so much, Randal, for your time this morning.
Thank you, Brock. It's been great.